we have many different ways in which we can approach it. I mean, we can get our investment banking. I mean, we keep relationship with investment bankers, with VCs that sometimes either have these portfolio companies or know of these portfolio companies. Sometimes we do. This is a very small industry. It's funny because it feels like it's a big one, but it's really not. Like at the end of the day, you always know someone who knows someone. And sometimes we just tap into existing relationships. And lastly, sometimes we just email the founders directly and we say like, hey, would you be interested in a conversation? It's not like we tell them day one, hey, we want to necessarily acquire you. And we may not be thinking that we want to. We may be, most of the times we are open to considering different ways, and we just have an objective that we want to achieve.
Welcome to M&A Science, where we curate knowledge from the best in M&A to continuously improve. If you're interested in keeping up the latest from M&A Science, subscribe to our free newsletter at mascience.com. Every week we share highlights from our interviews, invitations to events, M&A role openings, and other resources as we build the greatest community of forward-thinking M&A practitioners. Again, that's mascience.com. I'm your host, Kison Patel, CEO and founder of M&A Science. Join me today is Yvanna Perez-Morel, Senior Director of Corporate Development at Ulta Beauty. In addition, Managing Director at Prisma Ventures. Ulta Beauty is an American chain of beauty stores that carries both high-end and low-end cosmetics, fragrances, nail products, bath and beauty products, beauty tools, and hair care products. Each store also has a beauty salon. Traded on NASDAQ under ULTA. Today, we're going to talk about how to initiate partnerships to accelerate growth. Yvanna, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How about you?
I'm hanging out in lovely Manhattan over here.
That's wonderful. Well, Chicago's pretty sunny today. Can't complain.
Hey, that's always good at this time of year. I don't know how the podcast mode will change when we keep these up in winter.
Right.
Can we kick things off by learning a little bit about your background?
Yes. Happy to cover that. So maybe we'll start by taking a step back and giving you a high-level overview. So I'm originally from the Dominican Republic, very different weather than Chicago, if you ask me, and have worked in finance and investing for over 15 years with a focus on the consumer and retail sectors. I've worked and studied in New York, London, Chicago, and several Latin American countries, which I believe has only strengthened a little bit my perspectives on daily operations. So maybe to provide a little bit more detail, I started my career in investment banking back in my home country, where I had the chance to work and many clients across the board, multiple industries, but always had that focus on consumer and retail. Then, after completing my international MBA at Chicago Booth and London Business School, I continued my investment banking journey, if you will, at Bank of America Merrill Lynch in Manhattan, probably very close to where you are right now, in the consumer and retail space. There, I participated in many deals across M&A, equity, debt financing, including things like Hudson's Bay's acquisition of Saks Fifth Avenue, Carlyle's investment in Supreme, the streetwear brand, among others. From there, I worked at Estée Lauder. I worked in their finance and strategy division. Organizationally, I reported to the CFO of Tom Ford. But it was honestly a great experience, and I enjoyed supporting the brand as it grew. And I remember, like, one of the things I enjoyed the most was actually taking the brand international. Not that the brand wasn't international, but taking the brand to Tmall, so to China, which was something that was new during the time that I was there. So since joining Ulta Beauty, which is probably most relevant to this conversation, which happened about 4 years ago, I've created and implemented many processes to support the corporate development function, led multiple investments and partnerships, including Ulta Beauty at Target. And even more recently, I co-led Prisma Ventures, which is our new digital innovation fund. Today, the corporate development function at Ulta Beauty really works towards two very, very different objectives. One of them is a more traditional corp dev hat, if you will. So those are focused more on enterprise-wide priorities. And the other one is Prisma Ventures, which focuses on emerging technology startups that seek to shape the future of retail, which typically implies accelerating discovery, personalization, and convenience for our guests.
That's like the fun emerging technology right now. We get to have a
Yes,
camera virtually put on clothes for you and all that kind of cool stuff.
exactly. But put makeup, put eyeshadows. Anyways, I love it.
What the partnerships? Can we kick things off? Just like when should corporate development start thinking about partnerships?
It's a great question. It's one that it's interesting because I feel like we are always thinking about partnerships. And we're always thinking about how can we amplify our long-term strategy or help us to continue to grow our business, to the very topic of this podcast. I mean, I would bucket opportunities if I needed to classify them, I would bucket other overall opportunities as inbounds, where we typically are reviewing pitches, or let's say outbounds or proactive engagements of new prospects, I would say. So in either instance, the very, very first thing we do when we are going to evaluate a company is ask ourselves, could a partnership with, an investment in, or an acquisition of this company help accelerate or address our strategic priorities? So if the answer is yes, it's simple. We engage further to discuss in more detail and potentially move into next steps. So what happens on the other side of the house? So when we proactively engage, our approach typically tends to be very systematic. So everything starts with the enterprise focus as defined in our strategy, those priorities, right? Like those, in a way, come as a given. They come from the strategy team, the board, the long-term planning process. So we think about, okay, this is a priority where we could potentially accelerate the strategy, and we map what is the landscape and how exactly could we potentially partner with someone. So my team then partners with that very same team, so the enterprise strategy team, to consider building, buying, or partnering in order to achieve a specific objective, a specific corporate objective. So if we think about a partnership or an acquisition as the ultimate way to achieve that goal, engaging a potential partner is key, even when it's just to discuss an idea or multiple ideas in some cases about a path forward. But it's interesting because sometimes you come up with an idea and then you engage a partner and then they have experience doing that. So they ultimately make it better and you ultimately make it better together.
Can you help me understand partnerships within corporate development versus, I don't know, do you have like a partnership function? Because a lot of enterprise sales will have that. And the reason what I'm trying to get to is partnerships part of a step in the process to get an acquisition, or are we really looking at partnerships in general and then that may get progressed into an acquisition?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think this particular point, I would say, is very much common for the corporate development function and the Prisma Ventures function. And I would say, in general, it is not the ultimate goal for us, but it often happens. So it's interesting, but I'm actually working on one of those cases right now, which is why I'm kind of like laughing a little bit as you ask the question. I'm like, ooh, that has happened.
Can you tell me how that happens? Like, we're not naming any names or anything here, but I'm just curious because I like the idea of this. The reason I like the idea of partnerships in general, even though they can be tricky, it sort of tests investment thesis in a lot of ways. If it's around a go-to-market together, then you very well can get a lot of good feedback and insight into how well an actual combined entity would work. So how does that end up turning into an acquisition?
Yeah. So maybe let me give you an example for that. So in our Prisma Ventures team, we have a track that it's called own differentiated. What this really means is that these are technologies that are typically in our roadmap today, we are actively working and co-developing and collaborating with a specific startup. So we're working day in and day out with a portfolio company, co-creating with them. And let's say we're doing that very well, and it's working very well to fuel, let's say, part of our virtual try-on that we were kind of joking at the beginning, where we can get makeup put in our face or skin analysis. And then it seems to be the right moment for both of us. It's like, okay, well, they need capital, like we are interested, like it seems to match their journey for both them and ourselves, and both teams seems to work very well together. So we absolutely consider it if that is the case.
So it's like things are working out so well. Why not put something together on the table?
Yeah,
Okay.
and it's funny, but it's happening right now. And it happened back in 2018 when we acquired Glam Street, which is part of our virtual try-on experience, which is why I came back to that example.
It's something you conclude to. After a while, you have your review, think about it, and does that come up through the business or through corporate development, through C-suite?
Yeah, it's a great question. It can typically not C-suite. It can come up in many different ways. It typically comes from the business. So again, they're like collaborating, working every day, day in and day out. They work very well together. They know, as part of that very good working relationship, that there is something that's happening at the startup. We know that that's something that we would be interested in bringing in-house potentially. And then it typically raises a flag of like, hey, look, I heard this from the startup that we are partnering in. It raises a flag to the corporate development, so ultimately to my team. We're hearing this from the startup. It's really a great relationship. Should we move? Do we want to consider potentially building a business case to bring that startup in-house? So if that is something that ties directly into the digital innovation roadmap, which ultimately ties into our strategy, the answer is absolutely yes. Let's evaluate it. Let's do a business case. Let's do the proper diligence, and let's analyze whether that makes sense for us to bring it in-house.
Is that business case usually around we can do more together or this makes financial sense?
I love that question. Really depends by company, huh? But for us, it's all about the strategy. I mean, of course, the price needs to be within market, needs to make sense, right? But but it's not about the financial sense at all. It's really about the strategic rationale. It's about the strategic fit of the teams. And it's ultimately whether we think it's capability that we need for the company.
What does governance look like when it comes to partnerships?
So if you think about governance, our governance structure is really rooted in best practices, and as such is really, I would call it bespoke to each one of our two objectives that I mentioned earlier. So Prisma Ventures and the corporate development functions have completely different visions, missions, and processes, for example. So with Prisma, we have allocated $20 million to invest in early stage startups, which we're defining as like Series seed, A, and pre-seed, and as aligned to a specific focus areas within the digital innovation roadmap, which again ties to the overall corporation afterwards. For approval, our investment committee, we have an investment committee that reviews and approves investment proposals from the Prisma Ventures team, who are responsible for building the business case and showing the link to a focus area, so a roadmap, and maybe more importantly, that the startup team is the right team and is the right fit for our company and our brand. Conversely, on the corporate development side, the approval process really depends on investment thresholds. So very similar to the way that it happens in most corporations, I would say. At specific dollar amounts, our executive team can review and can approve investment decisions or acquisition decisions. But at larger amounts, oftentimes it requires us to engage a board of directors. Again, quite standard.
So you can basically, any of the smaller deals, pretty straightforward to get through, but then you do something bigger, it's going to go up to the board.
Mm-hmm.
On the venture side, you have an investment committee. Who's on the investment committee?
Yep. It's a combination of it's a combination of like the strategy, the corp dev function, and also ultimately the business leaders on the digital innovation or the digital broadly space.
Are they all in this committee, or do you put it together based on the deal?
They're all in this committee. They sit
A
permanently.
lot of people. How many people are in the committee?
It's not that many. It's not that many. I would say it is the people we need in order to make the right decision.
Okay, fair enough. And then everybody has equal votes, and they make a go no go decision when opportunities come up.
Something like that. I mean, it is important that it is the right fit. So if we feel like if there is pushback, we typically spend quite a bit of time just understanding why there is pushback and really resolving the issue until it's solved. It's not as easy as like saying, oh, we have 50% of the votes, then it goes. It doesn't matter whether it's more about getting to a collaborative decision and making sure that everyone is on the journey.
So let's break down the whole process of building a partnership. We talked a little bit about the strategy component, and we've
Mhm.
done a lot of interviews about strategy. So we get a sense, and something comes up. Hey, this might be an opportunity. You've built enough confidence to engage. Walk me through that, starting with that. How do you approach a target company?
It's an interesting question. And again, like I feel like no two opportunities are really alike. And as such, our approaches are really tailored to the opportunity. I mean, we can really use a range of ways in which we can initially reach out to a target company, whether it's a phone call, an email, personal networking, you name it. But let me share an example that I think illustrates how the conversation typically looks like for us. So the example is about Conscious Beauty at Ulta Beauty. And I'm not sure if you're super familiar with the program because it's very specific. So I would say it's our way to empower guests to make choices based on their values, such as clean beauty, um, cruelty-free, vegan, sustainably packaged, etc. So in practice, what that really means is you can go to Ulta Beauty or Ulta.com and you can search for your favorite products. Let's say I'm talking about Tarte's Shape Tape Concealer, which true story, I wear every day. It hides things very well. And I can easily see that that is formulated with clean ingredients, which matters a ton to me. I almost exclusively purchase products that are formulated with clean ingredients, and that's something that I actively look for. So back to your question, when we were about to launch Conscious Beauty, we wanted to make sure we leveraged the expertise of others who were established leaders in the space. So my team did some desktop research, understood what was the landscape, and selected a few companies that we wanted to engage in. And that included Credo. And Credo, for those of you who don't know, it's a clean beauty retailer based in San Francisco. Coincidentally, I was attending a beauty conference in LA, and their main investor, Next World, was talking about clean beauty and the role that Credo has played in space and all of that. So after the session, I just approached them and I was like, hey, can we connect offline and learn more about your company, your goals, and how Next World is thinking about the investment? We had several conversations and including others in the team, whether it was internal business partners and strategy, merchandising. But long story short, sometime later, together we shaped the partnership that we have today. And it really includes multiple components, but it also includes what we call the Credo collection. So you can go into our website or you can go into some of our stores and you'll see a space that it highlights the Credo collection.
That relationship you originated from the investors.
Well, I reached out to the investors because I found them in this LA.
Yeah, so you originated through the investors, and
Yeah,
they connect? They basically connected you with the company then.
yeah. And we were always, because they had a very strong investor, um, we were always talking to both the investor and the management team.
I like the idea of that because sometimes we forget to do that. We get so fixated on going to the company directly
Mhm.
that that makes sense. And you got them at a trade show. It wasn't through typical cold outreach.
Right. And honestly, if you like, you can analyze this from two ways and kind of like how we approached it, or you can analyze it as like how we approach it from their perspective or how we approach it from our perspective. But if you think about it and you pause for a second and you take a step back, There were many different components that I think are common threads. If you go back to like your overall question, it's like one, there is a clear link to this to a strategic priority, which was clean beauty, and our goal to leverage partnerships to gain expertise in that space, right? Second, there was an interest and admiration for a specific set of companies that we had researched and knew were strong players in the space. Third, there was an initial approach that included a few players and did not focus on partnerships, but rather on an interest in learning more about a company and building a relationship and ultimately understand if it could be a fit. And last, there was a joint effort to shape the partnership over time to ensure that it was a win-win for both sides. I mean, if you take it back to your other point about the time, it does take time to build a relationship, but sometimes that time works in the benefit of everyone involved.
So the strategy is what guided a lot of this, and you had that narrative as you reached out to the investors, sort of shared your vision and what you were interested in. And
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned, I like the line that you used about wanting to understand their investment because they obviously have an investment thesis in the company.
Yeah.
And for them, that's always, hey, let's get together and compare some industry notes. Those are always fun conversations. And then they get together and then like, this makes a lot of sense. Let's make that introduction happen.
Yeah. And honestly, at the time, we didn't have a specific, we want to have a shopping shop in our stores and have a shopping shop in our website. I mean, we had a goal and we had a couple of ideas, but it was together that we jointly developed what the relationship became. I mean, it could have been something else. It could have been anything in the spectrum, actually.
What are other approaches you've done to reach out? Because you don't always get this benefit. Sometimes you have to find other avenues. What do those look like?
We have many different uh ways in which we can approach it. I mean, we can get our investment banking. I mean, we keep relationship with investment bankers, with VCs that sometimes either have these portfolio companies or know of these portfolio companies. Sometimes we do. This is a very small industry. It's funny because it feels like it's a big one, but it's really not. Like at the end of the day, you always know someone who knows someone. And sometimes we just tap into existing relationships. And lastly, sometimes we just email the founders directly and we say like, hey, would you be interested in a conversation? It's not like we tell them day one, hey, we want to necessarily acquire you. And we may not be thinking that we want to. We may be, most of the times we are open to considering different ways and we just have an objective that we want to achieve.
What does that email read like? Just say, I got a company. I got the new hottest, what would be a trending thing right now? I think the skin protection, SPF lotion.
Yeah, could
Ever.
be.
It's for men and it works really well. It's a hot thing. It's some new technology there. It like tans you. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know. Anyways, we got a skincare product that's you're interested in it. I got a little startup and I'm anti-corporate and that's like part of my branding. But I got this big growing following and I don't know, it seems like you'd be interested. How would you reach out? What would that email read like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I would say it really depends, but it would be something like, hey, we are interested in understanding better your technology. Would you be open to having a 30-minute call with us and just showing us what your technology does and how and like we're just curious. We just want to learn more. Another thing that is very distinct to Prisma Ventures in particular, which is typically that focus for startups, is that our team is also includes founders. So, for example, Agustina Sartori, who's my co-lead of the fund, is a founder herself. So she was the founder of Glam Street, which we acquired in 2018. So she has like that perspective of like, okay, when I was a founder and I was talking to whether it was Ulta Beauty, but she was talking to other companies as well and other VCs and others in the space. Here was my perspective, and here's how I reacted to some of these things.
Yeah.
I think that's unique. I don't think that all corporations have someone in such a direct position that just understands the founders.
So that we got the partnerships, we had this first date conversation, get to know you. and I want to learn more. And they said, all right, we'll, open the conversation, right? We get a meeting booked. What does that look like? Do you have an outline for it? Is there some framework you follow, and how do you structure that first meeting?
The approach changes materially from company to company. You could have probably foreseen that by now. Like I think I've mentioned it a few times, but it really reflects the way in which we do business, because we don't want something that it's only good for us. It has to ultimately work for both sides. And no two deals are ultimately the same. So as looking to form those mutually beneficial long-term relationships, we take a truly holistic approach. So let's say we're considering multiple structures. We typically don't even know whether we want an acquisition or whether we want the investments from day one. I mean, for Prisma Ventures, yes, we have a set of criteria and processes, so to speak, like um, a little bit more standard, I would say, but for curb depth, not at all.
This is like going on a date. You're not going to plan that much details.
Yeah.
You sort of have a location, a time. And
I love that. I love that analogy. And I think that customization ultimately, whether it's on a date or whether it's on a deal, it's key for multiple reasons. I mean, let's consider the variety of partners we engage with. I mean, we have early stage startups like QM Scientific, also acquired in 2018, right? And we have like established corporations like Target, where we created that shopping shop. You can never I mean, I shouldn't say never, but it's really tough to take the same approach when you have such wide range of potential targets. Second, I mean, every company is unique, just culturally and financially. They're facing different challenges, right? And third, and perhaps most importantly, each deal really aims to accomplish a different goal.
I think going back to the corp dev position, obviously you're working with companies of varying sizes, but specifically startups that don't have a very mature partner model or even experience with partnerships. How do you approach that?
Yeah. So if they don't have that, then that's something that we can certainly guide them and help them along that journey. I mean, we have part of our job is it's the education honesty component, both externally and internally. And we do oftentimes just share that, hey, here's how this process could potentially look like. I think it's important to first determine what the goal is and make sure that we are both okay with that goal, and the strategic rationale, that we are both okay with the how we are thinking of solving that goal. And then I think what you're getting at is more on the processes. And on the processes standpoint is something that it's easy in a way for us to educate. Processes in place is something that we do have, even though we don't necessarily have a structured way in which we approach every partnership. But after we know that we are going to do something and we know the more or less how, meaning is it going to be a partnership, an acquisition, or investment, or what, then we have a very specific process that we can follow and we can be very efficient. It's cross-functional, and it just helps us just get things to the finish line in a way that everybody comes along the journey. So whatever that partnership is, it has to tie directly to the enterprise. It has to achieve the goal of aligning to the prospective partner's values and making sure that those align with those of Ulta Beauty. And it does leverage a cross-functional diligence process, which we clearly outline and we can educate externally and internally to achieve, if that makes sense.
Align on goals, talk through the how, run through the process.
That's it.
You're making this sound way too easy. What's the hard part?
It's it sounds easier than it is. I really enjoy my job, so I love doing this. But honestly, ultimately, you're solving for so many goals and so many aspirations and objectives, both from internally from the business teams to externally from the founders, that it is sometimes the hardest thing is just getting everyone on the same page and making sure that everybody understands that we have a common goal together, and that we can flex on the issues that are not key to you personally, and we are going to flex on the things that are not key to us as a corporation, and we can get to a place where 1 + 1 may equal 3.
You got any other tips? I'm still trying to latch on to the hard part of doing this, because it sounds like you go out, you meet, you see if you really got a common goal and are aligned about that. Are there any nuances that you pick up on to get a sense if that's a good working relationship? Like, have you ever had it where I like the company and their product and where they're going, but I really just don't like these people and don't think we're going to be able to work well together?
Yeah, that happens all the time. You would be surprised.
Tell me that. Tell me, how do you pick that up? Is it a pure gut feel? Then is it, how do you know it's not a bias with just you? Do you bring other colleagues in, try to cross check that? Like, what does that look like?
No, it's a great question. So the main things that we want to review in a deal, I mean, a large majority of deals fail because of that lack of, if the teams cannot really, if the culture is not a match, it can be really challenging to integrate and really make the deal work. So I would say, when do we realize it? To your question, when do we realize? Sometimes it is a very first meeting, and I am there with my business partners. I'm typically there with my business partners. I'm never there alone. And we just sit around the table or sit around a couple of conference calls, and it's very obvious. And it's just like, we just don't work in the same way. We just don't approach things in the same way. We're just not looking for the same things. And sometimes it takes a couple of iterations. Sometimes it takes all the way to working together. In some of these co-creation examples that I was providing earlier, we are co-creating with a company. We are working together. Our teams are working together day to day. And then we realize that it just doesn't work. Like, and that we cannot work together day in and day out, or we have different approaches. And it doesn't mean that their approach is better or their approach is worse. It just means that it's different. Maybe they would be very successful with a different team, but it might not be the right fit for our company.
Are there any like clear tactical things that you're looking for? I'm thinking of all these conversations where people try to make the culture assessment into a very pragmatic thing.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any key things like that? Or is it more like dating and you sort of pick up all these variables that make your conclusion pretty quick about people?
Yeah, I would say it's a combination, and I would say most of the times the dating component and the feel is what gives you the right answer most of the times. We do have a couple of like pieces where, as part of diligence, we evaluate kind of like the harder components of the deal, and depending on what type of deal, we may be doing some surveys. Like, it really depends on the type of deal that we want to do, but we do evaluate that people component we take it very seriously.
I heard they have AI tech that can actually like read sentiments of companies' emails and then sort of spit out what the culture is like and kind of tell you.
Oh, wow.
I don't know.
I would love to see that, though.
Anybody knows somebody at a big consulting firm listening to this, and just send them my way. I'd love to talk to them about that. I'd be really interested to see how that works.
Yeah.
I got a great pitch I can give to Ulta here with Yvanna. Okay, so we talked through just the culture fit part of it. Are there any, if you think of the timeline of an M&A deal, right? We got the sourcing component of it, and then you get up to IOI, unless you're better enough to go right directly to the company and go straight to LOI, and then you move right into your confirmatory diligence and close, and then you got a whole integration. What does that timeline look like when it comes to partnerships?
Yeah, it's typically very similar. So you have some sort of agreement, whether you can call it a IOI, LOI, or you can call it just an agreement, but you have some set of like high level terms that you're discussing and that you're working towards. And then you have what you call confirmatory diligence. You have some sort of diligence where you're just talking through, okay, so what example, and it's a different approach, right? Like, you're not looking into, are the financials of the company what you thought, or like this is different. you're looking at, okay, so the devil's in the details. How exactly will this work? Take the Target example, for example. Which stores are we going to be in? How are the employees going to interact with with the guest? How is the loyalty program going to be structured? Is it going to be access to it? Are we going to give access to Ulta Beauty's loyalty program, or is it only going to be Target? Like, it's really a lot of different components that you are really vetting. So think about that as the pre LOI, IOI, or pre high level agreements phase as like high level. We want to do this. These are the sort of terms that we think we can make this work at. And then you go through, okay, the devil's in the details. Let's understand that better. What does that mean for 1, 2, 3? And then all the processes that are in the background that need to move in order for that to happen. Then, of course, there is a legal component that is happening in parallel, if you will. So there is drafting of contracts and understanding how exactly is that relationship going to be governed, as well as the governance piece, which is like, can both sides approve those set of terms that the business teams are kind of like aligning towards? And then you get to the signing of the deal, or the conclusion of the deal, the closing of the deal. And then the most important, if you will, I mean, it's hard to say that it's the most important, but it's a key component, is the integration. Then that's where it really, even though you're not integrating two companies, in a way, even if it's a partnership, you're integrating two teams. Like, you have two teams that are talking basically every day to make this happen and to make this successful.
How do you keep that from getting screwed up? Like, I feel like that's the thing I make a mistake on, is I make the deal for a partnership, but then the execution fails. Yeah, I had a question on that. And then I guess the diligence of a partnership. So let me first ask you that. For the diligence of a partnership, how much diligence actually happens? Because M&A, we do tons and tons of diligence. You know, do you set up a process and put up a data room and all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, data room, not necessarily, not for a partnership, but you have a set of processes, you have cross-functional teams. You also bring in, at least that's a way that we've done it in the past in multiple ways, we have the partnership with Target, the partnership with Credo, and others internally, right? Like, the way that you set up these processes is that you also bring in the team that will ultimately be responsible for executing it. So not integration in traditional sense, but will be responsible for delivering it. So they come along the journey somewhat early on, right? So that they are part of the whole conversation. They understand how are we designing the deal, why, and they can provide some insights. Typically, those are somewhat senior teams, so they have an idea of how other partnerships and how what are some of the things that we care about as a company, and we need to just make sure that we hold hands as a team, and that the things that we ultimately agree on can be delivered from both sides.
When you talk about integration, then, is that our pretty static process that there's a template you follow, or is there a lot of integration planning that goes? Does it happen during diligence, afterwards? When does that occur?
Yeah, it happens just before the closing. When we are towards the tail end of that, let's talk about the details. The devil's in the details. Let's talk about it in a little bit more detail. Just before the closing, that's where you spend a lot of time thinking, okay, how do you take this from a very detailed plan to an execution plan? And that conversion is so important. And that's where you just need to make sure that it can really be actionable and it can really be done. For example, if I agree that I will share some insights with your team about what's happening in our store, for example, or what's happening with the consumer, then, and I will do it every other day, but I don't have the systems to even generate the data promptly for me, then that is an issue. So we need to just make sure that whatever I am telling you that I can give you, I can actually produce it, and I can deliver on that promise.
Before close, we're going to double check that we got a clear game plan on how we're going to execute this, which is
Yeah,
basically our integration plan.
yeah.
And then after close, how do you make sure things are successful? The interesting thing is you got teams aligned. They sort of know what's happening and what they're accountable for doing. And I like how you contrast this with M&A because now it makes a lot more sense. You've gotten me a lot smarter about thinking through partnerships. And then ensuring the success. Are there sort of metrics that you're setting up to measure that success, or how does that work?
Yes, I would say absolutely yes. In every partnership, the metrics are different, but there are always metrics, whether the metrics are a set number of sales, whether the metrics are a set number of engagements of some guests, whether like, it really depends on each partnership, but there is always a set of KPIs that are tracked over time that we need to deliver on as a partnership team. And honestly, they typically do benefit both sides. They're typically not a one-sided, oh, I want this to hit this. Clearly, if the partnership is successful, that's where you see us hitting and exceeding, hopefully, all those KPIs.
You mentioned earlier you have a VC fund that you also run in parallel to all this. Differences between your approaches on forming those opportunities versus partnerships?
Yes. So first we do have a corporate venture capital arm, Prisma Ventures. So we're thrilled. I mean, we just launched this summer, so August of 2022. So it's hot off the press. And the fund really marries kind of like our digital innovation and our corporate development team. So our goal is in a way a little bit different in that it looks to accelerate innovation by nurturing partnerships with startups, pairing Ulta Beauty's size and scale with the agility of tech startups. And in a way of like agility and singular focus of those tech startups. So as a fund, we're looking to partner with earlier stage tech companies, primarily those Series C, Series A, pre-seed, and focus on a very specific set of verticals that we have defined, and they tie to our digital innovation roadmap. So happy to go into more detail if you think it's helpful for your audience. But I would say to date, we've invested in a variety of startups, and we just launched, right? But we had a little bit of a time just working through this in the background, and they've already enabled greater personalization and diagnosis within Ulta Beauty skin and hair experiences.
This is pretty cool. You're leveraging this venture vehicle, to get access to innovation, new technologies faster, instead of going on a massive buying spree and having your investor analysts out there question every move and tackle you on earning calls. You run this where you're making a lot of probably smaller bets, I assume. And then how does that work? Is it similar to the partnership? Is it different in that the way you get access to the technology?
Yeah, it really. I know you're going to kill me for this, but it really does depend on each
I know.
investment. You know where I'm going with this, but
That's fine. That's the lesson from all this. You can't create a checklist to do M&A deals, period.
right.
And you can't create a checklist to do the partnerships as that as well. So,
Right. Like you can create a checklist for processes, and you should, because otherwise you'll spend forever trying to set up every individual process, but it's impossible.
it's the strategy. It's like there's all these strategic decisions that need to make, and you can't. You best is get cleared on the thinking first, and then figure it out from there. I mean, it's got to be case by case.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's very similar processes, I would say, for both.
Okay. But then, things will spin different. We can go into a lot of details about that, have a whole other podcast. With any dating tips with the start? Because it is fun. It's just like all about this relationship that you curate and how that evolves and shapes into a real business partnership, any like do's and don'ts? The thing I struggle with, Ivana, is the keeping up the relationship, like the nurturing it. I screw that up because I'll meet a founder CEO, and it's like more than a year goes by, and I'm not really good at keeping up with that. And the worst is I've actually lost a couple of really good opportunities because of that. They've either sold their business or something. It's like I would have jumped all over that, and that's the worst, right? Even for a corp dev person, nobody wants to see one of their pipeline companies in the press release with a competitor. They don't want to see that. So how do you keep that from happening?
It's a great question, and it's important, and it's so important to keep those relationships alive. And sometimes you can't avoid it. And sometimes but where you want to be is in a situation where you choose whether you avoid it or not. Meaning, sometimes we are in the and I promise I'll go back to your relationship question, but it happens sometimes that we are in a process, in an M&A process, and we have an idea of who else is in the M&A process, or who else is in the partnership process, or the investment process. And sometimes we choose not to move forward because it's not the right opportunity, it's not the right strategy for us as Ulta Beauty, even though we know that some of our competitors are also looking at the same deal. And that's okay. But you want to be in the situation where you choose to say no, and not where in a situation where you see it in the front or second or third or whatever page of the Wall Street Journal after it has happened. But back to your question on the relationships, I would say it's tricky, but it's so important. Like we do try to keep those relationships alive, like especially the relationships with key advisors and key players and key investors in the space. And it doesn't have to be every day, but we make sure to like touch base, whether it's every 6 months or every 4 months, or depending on who it is, right? And how many things we have in common. I think it's really important to just make sure that we continue to iterate, and we wanted to check in. How is the process that we were talking about? And sometimes I have gotten calls from whether it's advisors or founders. Hey, look, my company is really in this situation, or I'm about to close a deal with so and so. Are you guys still interested? And that's exactly where you want to be. Like you want to be, you want to be in a situation where there is an open dialogue, and you can potentially even make something happen with that startup and potentially with someone else. I mean, it could be a three-party deal. It could be like, it really depends.
How do you remember to follow up with people? I feel like that's the fundamental problem there. Do you set reminders? You put in your calendar? How do you do that?
It's a combination of everything. We do leverage a software for that, but also a lot of good old Outlook reminders to make sure that we have this conversation. I tell you, oh, it would be great to just stay in touch and just connect, maybe in like the next year, or maybe towards the beginning of next year. And then I just put a reminder, and maybe I'll be reaching out to you in January to say like, hey, how was your holiday?
Yeah, I was going to ask what the re-engagement content looks like. Like, is it something like that, or because you don't want to be generic, like, hey, thought it's time to get a touch base. You don't. Nobody's got time to take those calls. So how do you sort of put a little weight on it to get the next conversation going?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Typically, when those, oh, it would be great to catch up and follow up or stay in touch. Typically, there's a mutual interest for that. And typically, there's a reason, right? Whether it's we share an industry, we share a set of, there's something that is driving that. And it's all about going back to that. And I would say the hardest times to do that are the very first couple of times that you connect with whatever individual or person or organization. Then it becomes easier. Then you know exactly what they're focused on. They typically know what you're focused on. And if there's a specific opportunity that fits, that they think it's a fit for us, or that we think it's a fit for them, then it becomes quite natural to be like, hey, I heard about this. This seems to be something that you would be interested in looking at.
Cool. That makes sense. If they like you.
Yes, assuming they like you. Yeah, I'm very, most of the times we like our partners in the industry. We've been very lucky, I would say.
Ivana, what's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
Oof. Craziest thing. Um, I don't know if I would call it crazy,
You
but
worked in banking. How can you not? I'm just kidding.
no, no, no. Where I was gonna go with this is like it's funny, but I continue to be surprised by how small the world of M&A is, particularly within the beauty industry. I mean, I love re-engaging people I worked with during my time in banking, to your point, who move some of whom are actually my peers now. So it's always great to like call people that are in similar positions at other companies. It is a small world, and you should always just treat others with respect and professionalism. Sometimes negotiations get tough, but it's important to just keep it up. So over and over again, I find investors and the leadership teams I interact with become future advocates, and in some cases, they become friends. So one example I really like sharing is that the CEO of one company we partner with unexpectedly referred me to this program called Chief. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it,
Yeah,
but
we've had a few other members on the podcast.
yeah, exactly. So it's a great program. So it's a private
As
network.
Christina Ungaro and Carrie Perez. I think we both of them been on the podcast.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no. It's a private network basically designed to support women in reaching high responsibility positions, right? Um, and that was unexpected to me that I just received a call one day like, hey, this person referred you to this program, and that's great. Some other counterparts have become professional friends, and I really just appreciate being able to we just build that network, which is kind of like personal, but also professional, and just being able to bounce ideas. So like in some cases, these are the same people I had some very heated discussions with at like on the when we were on opposite sides of the table. We were like, this is a deal breaker. Oh, this is a deal breaker for me too. But then getting to that like, let's break bread together, like that whole transition, it's really, I think, what has driven that mutual professional admiration for a lot of them.
Was that in the same deal or in the different role?
Different, different
Different
deals.
role.
Yes.
So after that, you sort of broke bread and okay.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can introduce that during a deal because that would help. That would help a lot of deals out.
Right. It's like, yes, it could get tough, but it's okay. It might be okay at the end
I
of the
guess
day.
it is part of negotiations. My team knows. I gotta go fly and get them drunk. I'll be book a flight. Let's get it done.
Right. Right.
Um, that's funny.
It's all about people at the end of the day.
It is. At the end of the day, it is all about the relationships you create to get things done and having aligned strategy and goals.
There you go.
Wow, thank you so much for this conversation. I enjoyed it a lot. I appreciate you helping me become a better M&A scientist. I can do partnerships better now.
Thank you for inviting me. So excited.
My pleasure. To those of you still with us, here's to the deal.